Hello and welcome to Policy Beats with Osama Nizamani. Today we have a very special guest with ourselves. Our guest today is an author of 2 books. He has written the book No Exit from Pakistan and also China's Western Horizon. My guest today is also a senior advisor on South Asia program at the United States Institute of Peace, and he's also a senior research fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. My guest today is none other than, you've guessed it right, Dr. Daniel Seth Markey. Dr. Daniel, welcome to our podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Daniel, I want to continue the conversation I had with Elizabeth in our previous podcast. And so I want to continue this discussion on the existing impasse in Pakistan-US relations. So, the issue of perceptions or misperceptions that have existed between the two sides, even in pre-withdrawal phase and also in the post-withdrawal phase. What do you think would be needed for both Pakistan and United States in order to work out or iron out these differences? And I mean, not just on the sides of, correcting them in terms of perceptions, but what it would really take for both to make some progress.
Well, first of all, let me say thanks for the opportunity to join you today. It's good to see you and good to be here in Pakistan.
Our pleasure is all ours.
And let me also just say that one thing that it may take for the United States and Pakistan to get past perceptions is time. And I know that we all tend to be a bit impatient. We'd like to turn the page of history more rapidly. Mm-hmm. But I think, I'm the older one in the room right now. And I'll just say I've been doing this for long enough now to appreciate that some things just take time. And just to say, we've been in a kind of a chapter of the US-Pakistan relationship, which has now books to it, but a chapter of those books for the past 20 years. Which has shaped and defined the perception, certainly in Washington, of our relationship with Pakistan and of Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And that chapter has been a kind of an ugly one in a variety of ways. It's had some positives, but it's also had more than its fair share of negatives. And it ended poorly with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer. And that, along with other aspects of the challenging working relationship with Pakistan, both ways, has left a negative perception in Washington. And so when you combine that with the reality, the political reality that faces the United States of so many other things on its plate and so many high priorities, all jockeying for attention, both domestically and internationally, in ways that have stressed the leadership and their, you might say, bandwidth, it's not surprising that it might take some time to circle back to Pakistan and maybe do what is you're describing, which is turning the page in some new way. And I don't know how much time.
Right.
But I would say that it hasn't been enough time yet. And we'll begin to see it. Right. Maybe we're beginning to see aspects of it this year, even with sort of the 1-year anniversary of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the killing of Zawahiri, and a few other things may shift attitudes a bit. We can get into that, but I think that the first answer is time.
So you're saying that, it would certainly take time for both sides.
I think so. I'm less qualified to speak about the Pakistani perception of the United States, but I do know that this has been a hard 20 years for Pakistan as well. And that the sense that the United States, we hear this all the time from Pakistanis in the United States or coming to visit us or when I'm here, that this has, that Americans tend to understate how difficult a 20 years this has been for Pakistan. We hear that.
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
And so that it should take some time for Pakistan to recover from that, recalibrate expectations for the United States, maybe see something more positive about us than has been the case in the not so distant past. That too, I think, takes some time.
Yeah. So now if I were to ask you now, ever since the introduction of the Indo-Pacific strategy, Pakistan does not weigh in the U.S. strategic calculus as it used to previously, especially vis-a-vis India. Now that India remains one of the critical linchpins in United States strategic outlook. So, what do you think, and what would you prescribe? Taking a fig leaf from your own book and from your own prescription. The book No Exit from Pakistan, in that very classical style. What would be needed for the United States to stay engaged with Pakistan?
Well, look, there are different ways to read my book, No Exit from Pakistan. I wrote it. I get to decide how I read it.
Which is the other one?
Right, I will just say, there may be another one out there. But the core of that argument was ultimately that Pakistan is too large, too significant in its own terms, population, major military, though not as big an economy as it ought to be, still an important economy in the region, and with a historical relationship with the United States and a geographical location that makes it relevant.
Yeah.
And so the point there was there's no exit, not meaning that we couldn't see the relationship go up and down, have its peaks and troughs, but that ultimately the United States lives on the same planet with Pakistan and will find that it will need to work with or against Pakistan simply because it's too large to ignore. And so when there's no exit, it means that you're stuck. Yeah. And that there can be periods of greater estrangement or pulling back. But ultimately, some of the challenges that brought us closer to Pakistan 20 years ago haven't gone away. We still have a problem of terrorism in this region. Fortunately, not nearly as acute as it has been at other times, but it hasn't gone away. Of course, this is a region which is unusual in the number of nuclear-armed states that live side by side, and that hasn't changed, and U.S. concerns about that haven't changed. We still have challenges of regional stability, even if the nuclear issue is not the one, whether it's Pakistan's relations with its neighbors in Afghanistan or Iran, and especially with India. And we still have a vast population of people that ultimately we'd hope would be living in greater prosperity and peace and more democracy, more freedom.
And which is also projected to grow by, I suppose, 440 million in the next 2 decades. So
well, we'll see. Floods don't help
exactly.
For population growth. But I will just say, given all of that, that means that these challenges persist. And the United States can't find its way to ignore them for too long.
Yeah.
So that's what brings us back around. So now Pakistan doesn't have an easy place. You're absolutely right. Doesn't have an easy place in the Indo-Pacific strategy. The U.S. relationship with India, among other things, complicates that. Pakistan's relationship with China complicates that. But we will have to find a way to navigate that, just as we do with other important countries, say like Saudi Arabia, which has been a very uncomfortable relationship, a very difficult relationship for the United States. And yet ultimately, even the Biden administration comes back around to recognizing that it's an important player in the world. I think it's not an exact analogy. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are very different countries. But we do find ultimately that we have to be thinking about Pakistan again. And that's where we'll head. Now, that's not a great answer to the specifics of where we fit it into the Indo-Pacific strategy. Years ago, I wrote about trying to think about Pakistan in the context of regional economic integration. I still would have preferred to see that world evolve and emerge in that way. It hasn't happened yet.
How would you visualize it if it were to take place? The reason why I'm saying this is because Pakistan recently actually announced its national security policy by stressing too much focus on geo-economics. So like looking at from, say, as a scholar, looking at that from the American lens, how would that have looked to you as an observer and as an analyst?
Focusing on geo-economics?
Yes, and also regional integration.
Yeah, the goal would be that, of course, that Pakistan does in some ways sit at a useful spot. If it were more of a trade and transit hub and opportunity, then its geography could be useful to other countries. Unfortunately, this hasn't materialized and it's not just on Pakistan. This has been a difficult few years. COVID and other things have made that more challenging. And of course, the blockage in relations with India holds up so much. And so, but you ask what I would say. It's not what I would wish. To see these things emerge this way. But I do feel that with these large populations in the world that we're seeing now, the economic ties do become the essential ones. The blockages need to be released by the politics to enable those economic linkages to come forward. But of course, that's more easily said than done. I'm not surprised that it didn't work. It's hard to snap your fingers and make the India-Pakistan relationship go away. It just doesn't happen. So I would say, actually, as I look forward, in some ways, this will be an even more challenging strategic environment.
Yeah, because as you speak about it, whenever I have conversations, say with Central Asians, or say even if you look at what the Chinese have been doing, with respect to Belt and Road Initiative or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it kind of strikes as a common denominator in terms of what you're describing over here. And I see enthusiasm in Central Asian countries towards Pakistan. You're right, that there's certainly a lot of baggage between India and Pakistan in terms of how we would want it to work out. But given that, there can be some progress in combination with other regional actors, I'm sure some headway could be made. And I find it at an analytical level, your observation as a kind of an overlap and a common denominator. But now moving on from here, Dr. Dan, I would like to ask you this one important question that, sort of lingers on everyone's mind. And it's that, just like Pakistan, a lot of Asian countries are in fact certainly concerned about, the ongoing competition between the United States and China, transforming into some kind of a confrontation.
Yes.
Between the two countries. And so the Asian countries and also Pakistan is slightly wary of, being in a situation where they're compelled to join one camp. How do you see, as a scholar who's based in the United States and would want to, as someone who would want to prescribe a policy, what would you prescribe in terms of ensuring that both the United States and China do not head towards this confrontational course?
Well, it is a concern, especially now, and especially over the past few months, as we've watched the tensions rise between mainland China and Taiwan. We've heard some very strong and what sound to me dangerous statements out of Beijing, concerns that nominally were supposed to have been related to a visit by Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House in the United States, but I think more broadly related to Beijing's aspirations to impose its will over Taiwan and to create a new normal in that relationship. And that is something that has the potential to be quite dangerous. So I think it's right for the world to watch and be concerned about this. Just like during the Cold War, the world would get nervous when the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to be edging toward crisis, because everyone suffers when that happens. I do think that there are a number of points of balance or ballast in the relationship that keep us from falling overboard into a conflict. And of course, the economic relationship between the United States and China is one. And a simple recognition that war or anything that looks like war would be unbelievably costly for both sides. That is still a core recognition. But I will say, the Biden administration has made a very clear outreach to Beijing, to Xi Jinping and to his top deputies to have conversations about what has been described as strategic stability. That is, let's try to come up with some basic rules about how to manage our crises so we don't end up in a war that neither side actually wants to be in. And unfortunately, at least as far as I understand, the Chinese have been unwilling to actually entertain these conversations. And I've found it interesting and disturbing, but it in some ways reflects, for those who have tried to have these conversations over years now, the Chinese unwillingness to engage on these issues seems to be related to a Chinese belief that greater transparency might actually be disadvantageous to China. That is, if they tell us more about what they're planning and what they're doing, and if we talk about these things, which from an American perspective seems to be a good way to avoid inadvertent or accidental crisis, the Chinese believe that talking about it may give us information that would be useful to the United States and would harm their ability to deter us from coercion or from even an attack. So they actually think that talking could be destabilizing or dangerous.
So they kind of presume that, having those conversations could compromise the ability to maintain ambiguity.
Yeah, their ability to threaten us in ways that they believe are stabilizing.
Right.
And this, of course, runs very much counter to American thinking on the issue. And I don't think it's just because we're strategizing to try to get their secrets. I think we just have come to different conclusions from our own experience with the Soviet Union that we do actually trust in effectively some degree of mutually assured destruction. We recognize that the costs are incredibly high. And in that recognition, we are willing to entertain that we could probably still have mutually beneficial conversations about avoiding crossing certain lines
exactly.
And misunderstanding one another. We do not believe that we understand Chinese decision-making very well, and we are worried that they don't understand us either.
Yeah.
And in that misunderstanding that we could be in a
this
very
could be
dangerous
very
place.
concerning in a crisis situation.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so we're worried about that. But we yet at this moment don't see a similar receptivity on the Chinese side. So anyway, that all makes the rest of the world, I think, probably pretty nervous too.
Yeah. I would just want to, sort of take that point a little further. Because I was listening to this one podcast by Kishore Mahbubani, and there they were discussing that, Jake Sullivan, certainly being the national security advisor, they have come up with some kind of a policy to make that outreach to China, as you just rightly pointed out. Do you, as someone, working in United States, have any inside view or any perspective into what the administration might have a plan in terms of, breaking that ice with China?
Well, they've tried. They use the president has talked about guardrails in the relationship. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has also been quoted on this, and they have made this outreach. There are, I believe, people within the U.S. government who have been thinking very seriously about what those conversations might entail. But until we get some kind of it takes two.
Yeah,
and if we don't get any kind of a response from the Chinese, then we're not going to get anywhere. Yeah. And now I will say in my own work, I have had concerns about the prospects for inadvertent escalation, not just between China and the United States, but in what we describe as Southern Asia. So China and India, and possibly in a complicated crisis environment, China, India, Pakistan. And that complexity in and of itself worries people who work on crisis management, because they believe that every time you add greater complexity, you increase the prospects that you could have some accident or something goes wrong, in which case that leads to an escalation and one thing leads to the next. Before you know it, you're in a serious war.
Yeah, those are certainly, I think, very concerning points, and they need to certainly be looked into. When approaching the management of the entire region, or reaching out to your peers or your competitors, if you're speaking from the American perspective. Just want to step back,
Sure,
and sort of come back to this very important point as we were speaking about this. A very low scale engagement that has been going on between Pakistan and United States, and as a result, although you're someone who's been frequenting the country, in the last few years, unfortunately, we've also had the pandemic, which sort of scuttled, a lot of face-to-face interactions between the two sides. But I do want to probe over here that how important do you see, as someone who's been a full-time academic, and then as someone who's a think tanker, how important is it for both Pakistan and United States to have collaboration between think tanks, to have that debate going on? Because I, for one, certainly see that, it has a lot of disadvantage when the two sides are certainly not talking to each other, not doing the kind of analysis that needs to be done in order to, as you were just rightly pointing out in case of China, in order to understand each other's perspectives. So how important do you see that scholastic exchange between the two sides?
Yeah, I think it's vital. I think that, I'll just speak for myself. I do always learn something when I come to Pakistan. It's not always the thing that the think tank that I might visit wanted me to learn. Might be something different. But I always learn something. I would anticipate that Pakistanis who come to the United States would also learn from the experience. And again, not always what we might choose to have them learn, but they'll draw their own lessons. Yeah. I think the pandemic had shut down a lot of that type of exchange. It's not just a Pakistan-US issue. Of course, we're not able to go to China either. And so those exchanges, to the extent that they've happened, have been virtual. Yeah. Virtual is no replacement for the real thing.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And so I think it's vital. I will say, the conversations are only a piece of the puzzle. We have the conversations in part to try out ideas with one another, see what kind of reaction we get. But we don't stop there. We then go back and do our homework, and we do our research. And sometimes, what we're told in the conversations don't hold up to the research that we do, and vice versa. Yeah. So it's a useful tool. I think it is almost impossible to get to know a country and to try to imagine how to advance an agenda with a country if you're unable to speak to the people who live there.
So what are three things, if think tanks are collaborating from both sides, what are three things that you would advise them to do in order to, take things forward in their area of expertise or in their own domains?
Well, look, I don't know about three specific things. I will say, I'm now at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We have interesting programming that with other types of institutions that happens in multiple ways. So we will do things like dialogues, whether in person, ideally, or virtually, if it has to be, which are intentionally intended to be alternatives to direct, say, government-to-government talks. So track 2 or track 1.5. I think these are important. I think they can be structured in ways that will be mutually beneficial. I think that it can be helpful when these take on some of the specific challenging questions that puzzle one side or the other, and can be done in ways that actually force some new thinking in the midst of the conversations themselves. So in the past, we've done things like gaming exercise or scenario exercises, which I find very valuable because they free people from their preconceived answers to every question. Because we are all presented with a question we didn't expect to have. And it's only then that you can begin to get a sense as to the things you might not have thought about before. When we retreat back to our preconceived notions, when we're given the space to just simply say what we already thought, the two sides will present their views. That's useful. But when we're forced to think creatively, then that exposes other differences or similarities and can be very effective. So for me, I like that type of exchange and interaction. The US IP also does work with independent scholars in other countries, and we work with them to support their research and to publish it. So we have research collaboration because we recognize that sometimes it's not just the dialogue, but the actually going out and doing data collection and having maybe more extensive interviews and other things that cannot be done in a group context that is really quite valuable. And then the last thing that we often do is we host individuals for conversations back in the United States, partially to serve as that bridging function to bring Pakistani voices to audiences that would otherwise not hear them. And we do this with others, with Indians, Bangladeshis, and so on. And that, I think, is really vital as well. You can't do, if you're unable to do these things, then you're shutting down, I agree, what we were saying before, you're shutting down valuable channels of communication, but also deeper understanding. And that makes getting back to any kind of a normal that much harder. We do almost none of these, say, with Iran. And it's been decades since we've done this sort of thing with Iran.
Interesting.
So it's not so much a surprise that there's much less understanding of Iran in the United States, and I would imagine vice versa.
Right. Taking this conversation from the intellectual forward to the more tangible element, and that is, let's say, speaking about the ongoing collaboration between Pakistan and China under the Belt and Road Initiative on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Do you think something along the lines is possible? Because, Pakistan, as I just mentioned, is making that emphatic call that it does not want to be part of any particular camp, and it would certainly want to engage with other international actors, including the United States. Do you think there's a possibility that if Pakistan is eager to engage in something, say, like related to the Blue Dot Network, or say, for example, the Build Back Better World that was announced by the Biden administration. How do you think the United States is likely to approach that call? And as you said that, perhaps both sides, and particularly US, I'm presuming, is likely to take more time after, withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right.
But how do you see, like, for example, triggers like calls for having more collaboration in events like these catastrophic floods that we have at this point could serve as, providing that pathway to have those kinds of discussions and conversations.
Right. So, I did see that a number of prominent U.S. officials were here in Pakistan because of the floods. The head of USAID, Samantha Powers, was here. Yes. And that is important. I think that is an important signal, whether by the Biden administration or the American people as a whole, that when these kinds of horrific things happen in the world, that we have an interest and that we can bring some capabilities to help address these problems, maybe not nearly sufficient in and of themselves to deal with the current tragedy, but that we don't stand by and say this isn't our problem, that we are a part of a solution. I think that's important. I think that's an important message to send. But I think that in terms of whether it helps us turn the corner to something new, it's conceivable. But I still think that back in Washington, the mentality, the view of Pakistan is still so deeply colored by that experience of the past 20 years that right now, we know what we did in 2010 when there were floods as well. Yeah. We try to be helpful where we can be helpful. I don't think it's a transformative experience, I think it gets us back to having some conversations that maybe had stalled, which is good. But in terms of really, turning the page, maybe not. You asked about things like the Blue Dot Network or about other areas of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Look, I think the way that the Biden administration has seen this, you have to understand a little bit about American politics to appreciate that part of what they're doing and part of what they've done since coming into office is to attempt to reverse the Trump administration's approach to the world, which was largely adversarial and basically dismissive of most U.S. alliances and partnerships. So where the Biden administration has focused its greatest attention has been on, say, NATO or other actual treaty allies in Asia and in Europe to show that the United States, at least under President Biden, they appreciate the value of those alliances. And then comes the sort of the partnerships that were already in play, like India, but not limited to India, in Southeast Asia, a number of other important relationships emerging, say with Vietnam, longstanding with Thailand and others. And those are areas where it's natural to then push things, whether it's the Blue Dot Network or other infrastructure, Build Back Better World. Those are the kinds of places that then get the next level of attention. Pakistan is in neither of those yet. And so that's where I said that, earlier, time maybe is required.
Perhaps.
And conversations, definitely. But anticipating a transformative outcome rapidly, I think is a bridge too far. I think that ultimately, in a way, if Pakistan is eager to see these things happen, Pakistan will also have to figure out how it fits into this new set of challenges in ways that the United States perceives them. Maybe Pakistan will choose not to see that. That's Pakistan's choice. But we are not in the world of 2001 or 2010. Pakistan, in the conversations that we're having and otherwise, will need to come to that realization.
And I think, it's really important why we need to have that kind of conversation going on. And it needs to have those cycles of conversation where you keep on, coming up with some kind of a message in order to understand the concerns of both sides. And then also to, get your point across also to the other side, where you understand what are some limitations on the other hand or on the other end. And where's that one tiny overlap or big overlap where we can actually work on? And those overlaps may actually vary from issue to issue. So
if I can just pick up on that really briefly, I would just say, look, the United States is in the habit of, when they have a counter-terrorism problem in Afghanistan or nearby, thinking of Pakistan as either part of the solution or part of the problem, but somehow involved. That's our habit. That's born over more than 20 years, actually. We do not have a habit of seeing Pakistan as somehow involved when we are thinking about the Indo-Pacific or about other major strategic challenges, whether it's Ukraine, North Korea, Iran, China. Pakistan does not present itself as a part of an American view of solutions to these problems, or even, if not solutions, at least ways to manage these problems. In other areas, maybe Pakistan will, but let's be realistic about recognizing if Pakistan is not a part of the solutions as America sees them, where does that leave space for that cooperation? It's narrowed. It's narrowed.
But as you just spoke about, for example, some of the Asian countries, and I may be digressing over here a little bit, but I thought, perhaps the example may be relevant over here. Like, for example, some of these Southeast Asian countries, while, they're really eager to have a relationship with the United States, but then they're also quite very keen on, maintaining its ties or perhaps expanding its ties with China. I somehow find that, Pakistan and United States have not had that conversation in terms of, because I think in the last 20 years, Pakistan itself has been engaged in the war on terror itself. And so, the developmental priority somehow went back on the back burner. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think Pakistan also did not get that opportunity to develop that context and to sort of make that case for itself also. And sort of, empathizing with Pakistan's position also. Yeah. Like in comparison to the kind of conversations United States can have in places like Vietnam, say in Singapore, or say for that matter, in Malaysia or Indonesia, or say with South Korea and Japan also. But I think with Pakistan, that context was not there, unfortunately. One way or the other.
The context, I mean, it's just very, very different. And we can think about it in lots of different ways. My perhaps simple way of reading Southeast Asia and parts of Northeast and East Asia is that for so many years, these countries perceived China purely in economic terms and in a very positive light. The idea of win-win really struck them as true and cut to the in a sense the depth of their you said developmental model. They were economic development first. Everything comes later. Everything else comes later. And when we approached those same countries, say after 9/11 or in that period, we were all about terrorism, counter-terrorism. And even in places like Indonesia, we had concerns about terrorism. And in other places like Japan or the Philippines, exactly. In other places like Japan, we saw them as potential allies for helping us in other places in terms of this global war on terrorism. So we had a very focused approach, and they were telling us, no, our interests lie in economics principally. And the Chinese understand that. And so there was a great opportunity for China to extend its influence throughout the region in doing so. What has happened over the past, again, to simplify, 10 or so years, is that many of these same countries in Southeast Asia have become concerned about the rising Chinese influence, not just economic influence, but political and security, military capabilities of the Chinese in their region, and have been hoping that the United States would, in a sense, come back, would fill that vacuum or compete with the Chinese so that they have alternatives. And so one, again, this is all too simple. These are very complicated issues, but one way for Pakistan to think about this is not so much that Pakistan wants to make a choice, because we understand Pakistan doesn't want to make a choice between the United States and China, but Pakistan would like to have the choice to make many choices in the future, to retain sufficient autonomy, to keep a place open at the table for other partners, whether it's the United States or Europe or Japan or China or even Russia, Turkey. There'll be many different players. And that what Pakistan really wants is to make sure that it doesn't sort of sign up entirely on one side or the other. And in doing so, leaving that space, then as time heals between the United States and Pakistan, or as time passes at least, maybe there will be opportunities seized there. That's probably the way to think about it.
Being an optimist, I see, this very period as an interval, where we're in that phase, where we're moving towards that, that healing process. And, having that conversation between the two of us is certainly, I see it as a reflection of that. You being over here in Islamabad and plenty of other scholars over here, that's a very good sign. And I think, we should have more of such interactions.
Can I just make one other point? In my role at USIP, I've been doing a little bit of work on Bangladesh. And I know this comes out of nowhere, but what's been so fascinating about this, among many things, is that when we try to do work on Bangladesh, the people who are easiest to attract to our meetings or who are most likely to show up at our events are the business community.
Oh, interesting. Is that in Bangladesh or also in the US?
In Washington.
Oh, wonderful.
Why?
Wonderful.
Because they perceive that Bangladesh is open for business.
Yes.
Bangladesh has done a remarkably good, I mean, Bangladesh has problems, we all know, but has done a remarkably good job at advancing its economic agenda, its business first agenda, creating a climate that has attracted major American businesses. And so they are the principal advocates of the US-Bangladesh relationship. They are really the ones who fill the room always. With Pakistan, it's almost the opposite. It's the strategic, the geopolitical, the politics side of the house. It's not the business community.
Interesting. So I don't know if you saw my conversation or watched my conversation with Elizabeth. This was one point which she also made, that instead of having a top-bottom approach, it would rather be better that the private sector from the two sides needs to make that outreach in terms of having those conversations. And I think that is perhaps what is missing right now over here. We should rather have Pakistani and American businesses making that outreach. And I think that since US does provide that openness in terms of interaction between different actors, so that certainly is one inspiration that Pakistan can take from the region, especially from Bangladesh, in terms of
Yeah, they've had remarkable success there. And so I would say Pakistani business community, American business community, in the United States, big business is not in control of everything, despite what conspiracy theorists might tell you.
Or on a lighter note, as what the other version of your book may tell.
Right. Yeah, we're not in charge of everything. But I would say, but yet has considerable influence. And when it is in the interest of American business to get along with another country, we find ways to expand our cooperation. When there is limited or no business interest, then the weight of the appeal is much less.
Yes.
And I think that's really missing. So again, to use the Bangladesh example, we're relatively light on strategic cooperation with Bangladesh, but we're open to it, in part because we're relatively heavy on the economic cooperation. And so both sides see enormous appeal to working with one another to resolve whatever other disputes we have. And we do have them. I mean, we've recently sanctioned the Rapid Action Battalion in Bangladesh. There are some tough issues to work through. But because of the business interests, we're eager to work on them.
No, that's very interesting. I think it's more about reconfiguration of priorities. I mean, things would have worked, say, in the last 20 or even in the last 6-7 years may not be relevant for the kind of
different priorities.
Exactly. So now moving forward and going back to another contentious subject in the region, and that it certainly is Afghanistan. I wanted to ask you that after the post-withdrawal phase, China and Russia have expressed a lot of interest in Afghanistan, and so I wanted to ask you, in addition, what could United States do to ensure that Afghan financial institutes, or when could they actually have the access to, the foreign exchange reserve that was frozen, by the Biden administration? How do you see United States playing a more proactive role? We're certainly not seeing a proactive, by proactive role, I'm not anticipating, again, going back to boots on the ground, but of course, diplomatically, what kind of role could it play in order to ensure that, Taliban meet some of their commitments, either it be with respect to counter-terrorism or with respect to, say, providing access to girls to, their right to education, or, the right to employment and other very critical rights. So what could U.S. do over there in order to ensure that, somehow these two areas are conditioned, and based on that, U.S. could somehow, start resuming that flow of much needed foreign exchange reserve to Afghanistan?
Look, no one in the United States can be so I don't know, egotistical to think that they know how to manage the problem in Afghanistan. We've been at this for long enough to realize that one could say nothing works, and yet we try something else and that doesn't work either. So it doesn't mean that just because what we've done in the past doesn't work, that some new thing will work. In fact, you can have everything fail.
Yeah.
And I say that with respect to the reserves issue, because right now we're holding on to the reserves, as you pointed out. I think in part, there are multiple reasons for this, but in part because that is one of the very few areas where we could imagine that we have some leverage politically over the current Taliban regime. It's something we believe that they want, and it's something that we have. And if we were to give this up, we can imagine, we can tell ourselves that we would then have less leverage even than we have now. And that's quite possible. I don't know for sure. Maybe that's true. Maybe if we had released the reserves, the situation would get far worse. We can't be sure, as some would argue, that by releasing the reserves, we create greater space for stability, which is the goal, and a Taliban that would be more inclined to work with us or to do things that we want. So far, we've seen no evidence that our outside influence, one way or the other, actually leads the Taliban to do anything that we want. They continue from last year till now to do basically what they will. And so giving up our leverage may help us, but probably won't. We may end up in a worse situation where we don't even hold that leverage. And there's an additional point there, which is the politics. One of the things that is useful to understand is that, can you imagine what the criticism of the Biden administration would be if it releases those reserves to the Taliban, who are clearly in alignment with groups that we in the United States continue to believe are terrorists, if they themselves are not labeled terrorists? Certainly their friends and allies are. And we would just be giving them the resources back, in a sense, to foster that type of activity. The politics of that are very dangerous, very fraught. It would be nearly impossible for the administration to take that criticism if it didn't see also simultaneously some huge benefit. What would happen on the day that those funds were released that would lead to a good news political story back in the United States? I can't think of what it would be. So I'm not sure that this is going to happen anytime soon. Politically, maybe there would be conceivably more of a moment for it after the midterm elections this fall. But even then, it would potentially be a costly move made for questionable strategic aims. Maybe would help the people of Afghanistan, maybe wouldn't. We'd certainly want to see a lot of things built in to try to assure us of that, some degree of autonomy or independence for the state bank, things like that, which are economic issues, technical issues that could be worked on. And I think they are being worked on. But anyway, that's a long way of saying, don't hold your breath. This could take a while.
Yeah, but it could, you rightly pointed out, it could turn into, or strongly turn into a bipartisan issue between the two parties back home in the States. But looking at some middle path forward, say after elections or sometime in the future, could it be then, reconfigured in a way where action or progress is expected first, followed by some kind of incremental approach to release funds?
We'd love to look in a sense. That's the I understand, and I think it's smart. And we, the United States, have tried out a variety of different ways of trying to use economic leverage with a variety of countries around the world. And one thing that we think we know is that giving resources in advance and hoping for the best doesn't usually work unless those countries have very strong institutions and their own safeguards and transparency built into the system already, in which case we can have greater confidence. But usually that's not the case. And so usually we've come to the opposite, which is what you've just laid out, which is that you make a deal. When you see progress, then you deliver the resources. So things like the Millennium Challenge compacts or corporation, that was entirely based, that entire model is that you come up with a compact for a state to live up to, and then you fund it. And in doing so, you wait to see evidence of success and then reward it. You could say, however, that that's exactly what we've been doing for the past year in Afghanistan. We were waiting for some sign that the Taliban would live up to its word on a variety of issues, whether it's girls' schools or an inclusive government or taking steps against terrorist organizations or whatever. And we haven't seen it. So we're still waiting.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why, this probably not like an idea, but like a suggestion or perhaps a possibility where, things could be worked out and perhaps not immediately, as you just rightly pointed out. Progress first and maybe.
Right. If we had in place a roadmap in which there were sort of milestones and you meet different markers, and when you hit this point, then you get this, and so on. That'd be nice. But even that is a politically costly gesture, right? From the U.S. perspective, that's basically at some point accepting the reality of the Taliban and in a way that goes, even just that move goes somewhat beyond where the administration has been. I think they'd be willing to do it if they had some reason to believe that they could see some progress and some initial goodwill on the side of the Taliban might help. I don't think that finding the head of Al-Qaeda in Kabul is the kind of thing that the Biden administration sees as goodwill. Exactly. I think they see it as the opposite.
Yeah, that's one vertical that, in fact, goes against, some of the terms that were agreed between the United States and Taliban. Yeah. So now I want to come to my last question, and, someone who has, enjoyed so much of expertise and continues to enjoy so much of expertise on, strategic matters. There's been a growing concern in Pakistan that, that perhaps the incumbent national security advisor of India, Ajit Doval, has been employing Doval Doctrine. And you, as someone, who's had quite an in-depth take on the region, do you see that, this apprehension that when non-state actors are employed, how concerning can it be for the regional stability? I was actually specifically referring to what you must have also come across, the Doval Doctrine, which actually does, rationalize use of non-state actors in pursuit of foreign policy objectives to coerce the other side, or here being Pakistan. So how concerning are these, actions, even from the lens of strategic stability?
Yeah, I think, look, if we could take out our magic wands and take away all non-state actors, we should do so. And in terms of strategic stability in Southern Asia, conventional military forces that are under executive authority are obviously more stabilizing than what we have in reality, which is a combination of non-state or state-sponsored groups that have clearly created opportunities for conflict between India and Pakistan in the past. So I would say, of course we should. However, look, Doval Doctrine or Ajit Doval doesn't take place in a vacuum, is a clear reaction to India's own felt experience of the use of non-state actors against Indian forces, and is a kind of bellicose, potentially reckless and escalatory reaction to that, but comes in the context of an India that has believed that the alternatives didn't work. So in a way, is sort of, you would say, India has felt itself forced into this. Had India believed that a softer, conciliatory, magnanimous, and conventional response to the security threat it faced was actually working, presumably it would have stuck with that. It hasn't. I think that I'm worried about the direction that India is taking in the region, but I can understand it. I know where it comes from. And I think that all sides, for the sake of nuclear peace, should really knock it off, simply put. But that doesn't appear to be the path that we're on. And it's not just, I should be clear, it's not just non-conventional that in Washington I think we should be worried about. It's happening. There's an arms race or an extension of competition in the conventional space, whether it's between India and China or India and Pakistan. There's an extension in the nuclear realm in terms of arsenal building, but also in terms of delivery systems. And this is happening at multiple levels, whether it's missiles or at sea. This is happening with investments by all of the parties involved, without considerable investments in either the dialogue that we talked about before, or investments in institutions that might encourage arms control, or at least confidence building measures or restraint regimes. None of that is happening. And it's also happening in other realms, whether it's cyber or space, particularly with India and China. Mm-hmm. All of these things are very, very dangerous. And yet also, I would say, coming from the United States, we too are investing in military capabilities. And we have been spending a tremendous amount of time and energy thinking about our capacity to respond militarily, and I would say less time and attention on a diplomatic response. There are those who are trying, but I'd say, if you looked and you weighed them in the balance, it's military first, security first, talk second. So to see India responding that way doesn't shock me. I see it everywhere I look. Yeah, I see it in Russia. I see it in China. I see it in the United States.
But how concerning is it in a region which certainly is nuclearized, which certainly has, that deep entrenched history of hostility between India and Pakistan?
Yeah.
So how do you see that as someone, who would see things more from an alarmist perspective? Well, how concerning could it be?
It is quite concerning. I don't think it's the solution. I would say, maybe put it differently, I don't think it's actually a great solution to India's security problems. If I were to sit down with National Security Advisor Doval, I would say, I understand your perspective. I do not think that this actually serves India's purposes. For the same reason, to use an analogy, maybe it's a little bit distant, but I do not think that the United States during the Cold War, by developing tactical nuclear warheads for use against the Soviet Union, was serving the interests of stability. I understand where it was coming from, but I think that it was a pretty reckless move to make. But we did it because we thought that would help to deter an adversary that was difficult to deter. And it would deal with a conventional imbalance that we were feeling. And I think that when states take reckless moves like that, as India may be doing, or at least as people perceive that India is doing, and that India is not saying that it's not doing, because it's difficult to see precisely what's going on, and I need to be careful about that. But when India does these things, it's a reflection of a sense of insecurity and a sense that other alternatives have been tried and found lacking.
Dr. Daniel Markey, it was such a pleasure to have you for this conversation today. I certainly felt very engrossed.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It's great to be back in Pakistan.
It certainly was, despite the fact that we had such a busy evening earlier today. But I really, really appreciate that you took us. You actually took your time out and shared your thought with us. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. And if you really liked our conversation today, please do remember to leave the comments below. Subscribe to our channel, and also hit the like button if you did like the conversation. Once again, Dr. Daniel Markey, thank you so much.
Thank you.